Hello there, dear listener. Tonight, we're going to wander through the forgotten joys of the medieval world. Not the battles or the plagues, but the moments in between. The days when laughter echoed through village lanes, when lords donned velvet robes for masquerades, and when even the poorest peasants found a reason to sing. This isn't the Middle Ages of grim sermons and grimier chores. This is the world of feasts, of fools, of dancing by firelight. So close your eyes, settle in, and let yourself drift back to a time when joy was rare, but fiercely celebrated all the same. The air is heavy with dust and noise. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith is hammering out the last dent in a battered helm, and the scent of sweat and horse mingles with roasting meat from roadside stalls. It's not just the knights who prepare for the tournament. The entire town transforms. Inns are overflowing, vendors shout over each other in a dozen dialects, and children scramble between the crowds, waving makeshift flags. At the center of it all lies the tournament ground, a long, grassy list field ringed with bright pennants, wooden pavilions, and ramshackle stands. For a few feverish days, this patch of earth becomes the heart of everything. Bakers sell overpriced pies, musicians tune their lutes in corners, and even the local monks seem a little less solemn. A strange mix of tension and celebration crackles in the atmosphere, as if something important is about to happen. And it is. For in this world of plows and pestilence, there are few greater spectacles than a proper medieval tournament. The knights arrive early, thundering in from distant counties and kingdoms, trailing squires and servants behind them like flocks of armored birds. Their coats of arms are painted on shields, stitched into banners, even baked into loaves of bread by enterprising vendors. They strut through the town as if already victorious, drawing whispers from the peasants and knowing glances from the ladies leaning out of windows. Some are household names, veterans of many circuits with reputations carved into the bones of their opponents. Others are fresh-faced heirs with newly polished armor and too much to prove. But once the trumpet sounds, it matters little who they were in the street. On the field, all are equals until the lances break and the dust settles. Behind the bravado and color, there's real risk. Arms are broken, ribs crushed. Sometimes men don't get up. And yet they come year after year, drawn to the promise of glory, gold, or just the fleeting illusion of being someone greater than themselves. For the townsfolk, the tournament is less about chivalry and more about escape. For 1 week, maybe 2, the drudgery lifts. The Lord repairs the roads, strangers bring news, jugglers, fire-eaters, and thieves arrive in equal measure. The local economy swells like a river in spring. A boy who spent the year chasing pigs might now sell candied apples to foreign knights. A girl who mended linens in silence might dance all night in a borrowed ribbon. The baker's booth becomes a flirting spot. The church bells ring more often, though not always for mass. Even justice is postponed. If you steal a turnip during tournament week, the constable might let it slide, unless you steal from a knight. Then you're lucky to escape with both hands. It's a time when everything feels slightly out of place, slightly brighter, and slightly dangerous. And when it's over, the silence afterward is almost too loud to bear. At the heart of it all is the clash. 2 men on horseback, armor gleaming, charging down the list like cannonballs with eyes. The crowd holds its breath, the lances lower. There's a moment, just before impact, when even time seems to pause. And then, thunder. Wood splinters. A cheer erupts. Sometimes it's joy, sometimes horror, always noise. After the match, the victor might bow or bleed or both. He might toss a token to the stands, a favor from a lady, or just a piece of his shattered lance. Either way, someone will scramble to catch it. The defeated knight might limp away to polite applause or be dragged off on a cart while a bored minstrel strikes up another tune. This is no sacred rite. It's spectacle. It's performance. It's a city turned inside out for the sake of a few glorious crashes. And for those who watched it from the stands, perched on barrels or crates, the memory will flicker long after the banners come down. Because for a moment, the world felt like something more, something bigger, something worth remembering. The music begins softly, like a whisper at the edge of a crowded room. Lutes, pipes, and viols blend into a slow, deliberate rhythm that seems to rise from the floor itself. Candles flicker from ornate chandeliers and candelabras, casting a golden haze over silks and velvets, pearls and brocade. And then they enter. Figures cloaked in mystery, faces hidden behind masks of painted porcelain, embroidered cloth, or feathered leather. Some masks smile, others leer. A few appear entirely expressionless. They reveal nothing, and that is the point. In this hall, identity is currency, and anonymity is power. Rank dissolves in shadow, titles are left at the door, and what remains is only movement. The glide of a slippered foot, the turn of a wrist, the breath held too long in a slow curtsy. To dance is to speak without words, and every gesture has meaning. A glance might promise something forbidden. A pause might condemn, and no one dares misstep, not because of fear, but because the ritual is sacred. These balls were more than entertainment. They were stages for desire, diplomacy, and danger. A duke might brush hands with the wife of his rival, and no one would know. A princess might trade whispers with a merchant's son, as long as both wore masks and played the game well. Beneath the glittering surface, there was always strategy. Every bow, every twirl, every offered hand was measured and memorized. Even silence was rehearsed. Courtiers practiced their turns like knights practiced swordplay. They learned when to lean close and when to feign indifference. A flicker of lace at the edge of vision might be an invitation or a warning. Those who danced well were rewarded with attention, gossip, and sometimes power. Those who danced poorly were forgotten, which in this world was a fate worse than scandal. Reputation hung in the air like perfume, cloying and inescapable, and the mask was the great equalizer, allowing even the most timid heart to pretend, for a night, to be someone bolder. The host of such an event spared no expense. Floors were polished until they reflected candlelight like still water. Walls were draped in embroidered tapestries, depicting scenes of courtly love and mythic battles. Tables along the edges bore sugared fruits, gilded pastries, and jugs of wine so heavy they needed 2 hands to pour. Servants moved like shadows, silent and ever watching, replacing goblets, catching a fallen ribbon, sweeping away a dropped glove. In the corners, musicians played without pause, their eyes lowered, their fingers practiced. Outside the castle walls, winter might be tightening its grip, or a plague might be smoldering in a nearby village. But inside, the hall was warm, fragrant, and endless. Time did not move here in hours, but in sequences. A pavane, a volta, a galliard, and between each dance the mask remained. No one asked, "Who are you?" Only, "Shall we?" And as the night deepened, The music quickened. Faces grew flushed beneath their painted coverings. Laughter echoed louder, though never too loud. Secrets accumulated in folds of fabric and beneath powdered wigs. Someone might be slipping a note into a sleeve. Someone else might be watching from the shadows, knowing too much. But even in the chaos, there was order. The dance had rules. The night had a script. And when the music finally faded and the dancers bowed low in farewell, the spell began to break. One by one, masks were lifted, revealing faces that looked familiar, but perhaps not quite the same as they had before. In the dimming candlelight, no one was entirely sure what had been said or promised, only that for a few precious hours, they had been part of something exquisite and strange. Something where the mask was not a disguise, but a kind of truth. Because in the Middle Ages, when the world demanded roles and obedience, the ballroom was the one place where hiding yourself meant finally being free. The hall is already buzzing before the food arrives. Torches sputter in their iron brackets, casting long shadows across the stone walls draped in crimson and gold. The scent in the air is thick, spiced wine, roasting meat, and the faint trace of sweat beneath silks and brocades. Tables stretch from wall to wall, lined with wooden benches for the lesser guests and cushioned seats for the favored few. At the high table, beneath an embroidered canopy, the Lord and Lady preside like icons, framed by goblets of gold and delicate trenchers carved from bread. Conversation hums, boasting, flirting, thinly veiled insults all passed along as easily as salt. A fool dances between courses, juggling apples and insults, drawing laughter that may or may not be polite. But everyone is watching the doors, because when they open and the first dishes appear, the room shifts. Now the feast begins. Now the true spectacle starts. The platters are carried in procession, not unlike a religious rite. First, the subtlety. A sugar sculpture of a castle or a fish with wings, too elaborate to eat, too strange to ignore. Then the roasted swan, redressed in its own feathers and crowned with rosemary. Pies appear next, stuffed with quail or rabbit, their crusts glazed to golden perfection. A peacock dyed blue and green is followed by a boar's head, its eyes replaced with currants, its snout stuffed with herbs. Bowls of spiced pottage, trenchers filled with eel in almond milk, glazed parsnips, honey-glazed apples, oysters, venison, lampreys, and white bread cut so fine it seems wrong to chew. Everything is seasoned aggressively: ginger, cloves, saffron, cinnamon, because taste, like power, must be excessive to be impressive. For every 2 guests, there's 1 knife. For every 10, 1 shared spoon. Fingers do the rest. Sleeves are stained, lips shine with grease, and no one seems to mind. The servants move like clockwork, replenishing goblets before they're half empty, sweeping bones into buckets, offering towels soaked in rosewater. Somewhere a harp plays. Somewhere else, someone vomits discreetly into a rush-covered corner and returns to the table without comment. This is not just dinner. It is performance, diplomacy, and hierarchy encoded in every course. The further you sit from the salt cellar, the ornate vessel placed on the high table, the less you matter. The closer you are to the Lord's trencher, the more your laughter is echoed, your goblet refilled. Toasts are made, often and loudly, to the king, to the bride, to the hunt, to the pope, to the victory, to the meat. It hardly matters what. The point is to raise the cup, speak boldly, and drink deeply. The wine is strong and unwatered. The beer is thick. The mead clings to the tongue. And as the night stretches on, voices grow hoarse, faces ruddy, and conversation less careful. By the final course, perhaps a custard shaped like a lion, or sugared rose petals floating in almond cream. No one remembers how many dishes were served. 100, perhaps, maybe more. The head cook will claim the number in whispers the next day, proud as any general. The guests remember fragments: the fish that blinked, the sweet that burned, the pie that sang. Some leave early, faces pale with indulgence. Others remain until the last candle gutters, heads heavy with wine, fingers sticky, minds soft. In the cold, gray light of morning, the hall will stink of smoke and stale fat. The rushes will be blackened, the benches askew. But for that one night, in that overheated, overcrowded hall, something strange happened. Hunger was not just sated, it was transformed into theater. And in a world where scarcity ruled and most meals were brown and silent, to sit at such a feast was not just luxury. It was revelation, punishment, and dream combined. The rumors always arrived first. Whispers in the marketplace, scribbled notes passed between monks, a baker's apprentice swearing that a rider had told him it was true. The king was coming. Not just a nobleman or a bishop, not even a distant cousin of royalty, but the king himself, with his full retinue, banners, trumpeters, guards, and golden stirrups. For most people in the town, it would be the only time in their lives they saw a monarch with their own eyes. And so the preparations began. Streets were swept for the first time in months. Garlands of dried flowers were strung from windows. The town's few musicians tuned their cracked instruments. The children were scrubbed, the pigs relocated, the worst of the beggars gently encouraged to leave. Everyone wanted to be seen as worthy, even if only for a moment, even if only in the blink of a royal gaze that might never come. Because when the king passed, you weren't just a baker or a smith or a widow. You were a subject, and for once, part of the performance. The procession could last hours. It began not with the king, but with noise. Trumpets blaring from riders in bright livery, their banners catching the wind like flames. Heralds with scrolls announced titles in booming voices. Pages scattered rose petals, or sometimes hay, if that was all they had. Then came the nobles, shimmering in silk, armor gleaming, hawks perched on gloved wrists, eyes scanning the crowd with practiced boredom. Horses stepped in rhythm, their hooves muffled with cloth so as not to startle the ladies. Carts followed, groaning under the weight of gifts, treasures, barrels of wine, tapestries, hunting dogs, and whatever theatrical wonders the court chose to parade that day. And finally, the king. Always elevated, always flanked, sometimes veiled in fine gauze, sometimes barefaced and smiling. His cloak alone could feed a family for a year. His crown reflected the sun. People gasped. Women curtsied until their knees gave out. Men bowed so deeply they trembled. No one dared speak. Children stared as if seeing a god in a book come to life. And then he passed. A glance, a nod, maybe a raised hand, then gone. Behind him, everything blurred. The scent of crushed herbs, the clatter of hooves, the heat left in the street. And then the town exhaled. Laughter returned. The butcher's boy kissed the miller's daughter. A cobbler sold a shoe to a passing courtier and swore he'd charge double next time. Children ran into the road to grab stray feathers or petals. The poorest drank watered wine and claimed they'd locked eyes with the king himself. Old men swore this procession had been grander than the last, even if they'd never seen one before. And somewhere, a scribe began to record the details in careful script: the color of the royal cloak, the names shouted by the herald, the hour the procession began. Because even if no one else remembered, parchment would. But most people didn't need ink to recall. They would remember the sound of trumpets cutting through morning fog, the gleam of sun on polished steel, the way the world stopped, just for a moment, and they were part of something vast and gilded and far beyond their usual mud. That night, the town did not sleep. Torches lined the streets. Food was shared, even among neighbors who normally scowled. The inns were full, the churches lit with candles, the alleys noisy with songs too off-key to be reverent. In houses still reeking of rushes and boiled roots, children replayed what they had seen, marching in circles, pretending to wave from a litter, tying dishcloths into makeshift banners. The adults were no different. They told the story again and again: where they stood, what they wore, how close they had been. And always, someone claimed the king had looked directly at them. It didn't matter whether it was true. In a life spent bending backs in fields and bowing heads in chapel, to be acknowledged, even imagined, was enough. Because the royal entry wasn't about the monarch at all. It was about the people who watched. A staged miracle on dusty streets, reminding them that they were seen. That, at least once, the world turned its eyes toward their little corner and found it worthy of pageantry. Before the first bite was taken, before anyone reached for a goblet or wiped their hands on embroidered cloth, they stared. They had to, because what stood in the center of the table was not food in the ordinary sense, but a spectacle, an illusion, a joke and a marvel in equal measure. A swan, roasted to golden perfection, redressed in its own snow-white feathers and crowned with a circlet of gold leaf. Its wings, carefully posed, made it seem ready to take flight. Around it, smaller birds peered from beneath pie crusts shaped like castles, stars, or boats. Some of those birds were alive, hidden inside hollow pastries, and would erupt in flapping confusion when the crust was cut. An intentional surprise greeted with laughter and applause. A trout dyed bright red with saffron sat beside a sturgeon, painted blue with ground lapis. A pig's head grinned up at the ceiling with apples for eyes. And always, some centerpiece animal, a goose, a deer, a boar, stuffed with smaller beasts like a grim culinary puzzle. A chicken inside a duck, inside a goose, inside a pig. A feast within a feast, for no reason but wonder. It was not merely about eating, it was about staging. These great dinners, especially in noble courts, became theaters of food. The kitchen was the backstage, the servants, the stagehands, and the dishes, the actors, each with its cue, its entrance, its gasp from the audience. A fish might arrive with horns, crafted from sugar or painted dough, accompanied by a scroll declaring it a beast from the Holy See, sent by Neptune himself. A dessert shaped like a fortress might collapse to reveal a roasted peacock hidden inside. Even the humble egg could be turned into a trick, emptied through a pinhole, filled with almond custard, resealed, and served to astonished guests who found cream where they expected yolk. Cookbooks from the period read more like magic manuals than recipes, filled with instructions for coloring, disguising, and animating food. A pie might be served that, when sliced, played music. thanks to a small organ placed beneath the table and activated by a hidden lever. No one came simply to eat. They came to be amused, confused, and impressed. Hunger was rarely the point. The ingredients themselves were chosen for symbolism as much as for taste. Pomegranates for fertility, eels for secrecy, almonds for refinement. Sugar was used not just for sweetness, but for sculpture, molded into towers, crowns, saints, and beasts, tinted with crushed flowers or gold. Some guests hesitated to eat these creations, unsure whether they were food or ornament. Others tore into them gleefully, laughing as they devoured a sugar bishop or shattered a candied dragon. To be seen enjoying such absurdity was itself a form of courtly literacy, proof that one understood the joke, that one belonged. Meanwhile, those who prepared the dishes toiled in heat and noise, turning rare spices and bleeding meat into visual poetry. The cooks rarely attended the feast itself, though their names were whispered afterward. A good cook could gain fame second only to a knight. A great cook could be loaned to another court like a prized hawk or stallion, dispatched to impress foreign dignitaries with edible marvels. As the feast drew on, the line between nourishment and narrative blurred entirely. Stories unfolded on platters. A fish from the Garden of Eden was served with an apple in its mouth and a serpent sculpted from pastry coiled beside it. A roast deer bore an arrow through its side, and a ribbon claiming it had been felled by the lady of the hunt. Even the drinks played along, wine tinted green for alchemical themes, or served bubbling from a cauldron lined with hot stones. Every dish spoke in riddles, every course raised the stakes. And when the guests finally stood, full and dazed, they left not just with meat in their bellies, but tales on their tongues. They would recount the moment the goose exploded with songbirds, or the time the jelly castle melted into a fountain of rosewater. Long after the flavor faded, the memory remained. Because in that world, where life was often brutal and brief, food became fantasy. The table was a stage, and the feast, in its most glorious form, was nothing less than magic. It began, always, with laughter. Not the quiet kind, but the full-bellied, dangerous sort. The kind that rolled through narrow streets and slipped under church doors. For a few days each year, order was overturned. The bishop's chair was borrowed by a choir boy with sticky fingers. The baker's apprentice was crowned in cabbage leaves and cheered by the same nobles who usually ignored his existence. And in the center of it all sat the Lord of Misrule, chosen not for lineage or virtue, but for brazenness, wit, and sheer chaos. Sometimes it was the cook, sometimes the gravedigger. Once it was a one-eyed beggar who ruled over dukes with a ladle for a scepter. For these few delirious days, he was untouchable. He issued proclamations in rhyme, judged disputes with dice, and declared that wine should replace blasphemy in all fountains. No one resisted. That was the rule. When the world turns upside down, you laugh or get left behind. The court played along, because to resist the joke was to become the joke. The steward might be ordered to dance for his dinner. The chamberlain forced to marry a goat in a mock ceremony that ended with both being pelted in grain. Priests read psalms backwards while wearing pigs' heads. The lord of the manor, draped in burlap and ash, was dragged through the hall on a wheelbarrow to be reborn as a lowly serf. And through it all, the Lord of Misrule presided with theatrical dignity, declaring absurdities with a straight face, blessing crowds with onions, and condemning those who failed to laugh to imaginary stocks. There were no rules, except that the powerful must obey the powerless, and dignity must be mocked at every turn. For once, nothing sacred was safe. Even saints might be parodied in puppet shows, where angels danced on chamber pots and devils preached sermons on greed. The origins of this inversion were tangled in both pagan ritual and Christian discomfort. It was, officially, part of the Feast of Fools, or the 12 Days of Christmas, but its spirit was far older. It echoed Saturnalia and solstice rites, when the boundaries between high and low, sacred and profane, were blurred on purpose. The Church disapproved, of course. Councils condemned the practice. Bishops issued edicts. But the people ignored them, because they knew something the bishops didn't. Laughter was survival. For a peasant whose life was ruled by frost, hunger, and silence, mocking a knight with chicken feathers was not just rebellion, it was therapy. And for the knight, laughing at himself might be the only form of humility he'd ever taste. There was freedom in it, but also danger. Sometimes the line between parody and insult blurred. Sometimes fists flew, but most often it ended in exhaustion, spilled ale, and strange friendship that lasted exactly as long as the foolishness did. And then it ended. The mask came off. The Lord of Misrule became the cook again. The Baron washed the ash from his sleeves. The goat was returned to its pen. A hush fell over the hall. Not sorrow, not regret, but the silence of something sacred finishing its run. For a moment, the world had been rewritten by jesters and stable boys. For a moment, the absurd had become divine. And though the real lords would retake their chairs and the real priests their pulpits, the memory lingered. Somewhere in a dark corner of the keep, someone still wore a crooked crown of twine. Somewhere, someone whispered that maybe the cook had made a better ruler than the count. And maybe, just maybe, the world made a little more sense when fools were in charge. Because at least then everyone knew they were pretending. The cathedral smelled of incense, candle wax, and cold stone, as it always did. But on this day, something was off. The boys in the choir couldn't keep straight faces. One of them wore a crooked mitre made of paper and ribbon. Another had tucked a goose feather into his sleeve like a bishop's crozier. The altar was dressed as usual, but a small wooden pig had somehow found its way onto the cloth, and no one had removed it. The clergy stood by, looking neither amused nor horrified, only resigned. Because once a year, during the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the boys took over. A child, usually one of the choristers, was elected as bishop. He wore mock vestments sewn by giggling hands, processed through the nave to real organ music, and took his seat in the bishop's throne. He would bless the people with theatrical solemnity, deliver a sermon written in rhymed nonsense, and preside over a mass where nothing quite went according to plan. It was tradition. It was tolerated. And it was cherished in ways no one said aloud. No one quite knew when the custom had started. Some whispered it was Roman in origin. Some claimed it came from the East, and some just said it had always been done. In England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, wherever cathedrals loomed and boys learned to sing Latin by rote, the boy bishop appeared. He ruled not just in jest, but with ceremony. His face powdered, his hands raised in mock benediction, he offered blessings to townsfolk who played along, kneeling before a 10-year-old in patched boots and borrowed dignity. The townspeople smiled, half in reverence, half in mischief. Coins clinked into collection plates as usual. Candles burned as always. But the tone was different, lighter, uncertain. like a laugh held behind closed lips. The gospel might be read backward. The prayers might be sung in animal noises. And through it all, the boy bishop presided with the grave solemnity only a child can muster while desperately trying not to giggle. The clergy, for their part, stood aside. Some frowned. Some turned their faces to the pillars. And some, usually the older canons, allowed a thin smile to pass across their lips. Outside the cathedral, the mood was even more relaxed. The boy bishop led a procession through the town, blessing pigs and pastry vendors, sprinkling holy water on ale barrels, waving to crowds from a makeshift litter. Sometimes the choir boys staged mock trials in the town square, condemning vegetables to death, or holding debates over the sins of the local rooster. The laughter was not mean. It was strange, yes, absurd, but not cruel. It was as if, for a brief moment, everyone had agreed to take a step sideways out of time. The world bent, the rules softened, and holiness wore a smirk. For children whose days were usually filled with strict discipline, early prayers, cold dormitories, endless repetition of psalms, this was a day of bright inversion. But it wasn't just for them. The whole community watched, cheered, and played along, because in a world so tightly ruled by hierarchy, the sight of a child on a bishop's throne was not just funny, it was liberating. And then it was over. The robes were returned. The incense holders wiped clean. The boy went back to his lessons, his feet back on the cold stone floor. The elders resumed their place at the altar. The music shifted back into minor tones. But something lingered. Not just memory, not just the aftertaste of laughter, but a strange reverence for what had just happened. It wasn't heresy. It wasn't mockery. Not really. It was a reminder, delivered with childlike absurdity, that even sacred things could smile, that even rituals needed a day to breathe. And maybe, just maybe, that holiness didn't always come from the tallest hat or the deepest voice. Sometimes it came from a boy in borrowed robes, grinning behind the altar as he declared that the goose was indeed a saint and that God surely had a sense of humor. The masks went on before the sun even rose. Thin leather for the rich, painted cloth for the poor, animal faces cut from wood, saints etched on parchment, devils stitched from rags. Some covered only the eyes, others swallowed the whole face. But once they were on, the world shifted. You couldn't tell lord from beggar, nun from jester, wife from soldier. That was the point. For 3 days, names dissolved, roles crumbled. The man who bowed to you yesterday might now be barking like a dog, and the widow who sold you onions might now be dancing on a barrel with her skirts hitched to her knees. Carnival had arrived. Lent was coming. But first, everything had to be turned upside down. The sins that would soon be confessed were now displayed like banners. No shame, no rules, only color, noise, and bodies in motion. The streets swelled with people. Music erupted from every alley, flutes, drums, horns, or just pots beaten with sticks. Painted pigs wandered through crowds, trailing ribbons. Someone wore a crown of fish bones. Someone else walked barefoot on stilts, shouting riddles in 4 languages. Boys threw flour from rooftops. Girls smeared soot on passing faces. Every house spilled into the road. Fountains were dyed with wine or milk. Even the clergy, though scandalized, locked their doors. Carnival didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for approval. It roared through the town like a fever and dared anyone to resist. Food sizzled on open fires. Sausages dangled from doorframes. Bread was thrown like confetti. People drank, then drank more, then forgot why they had started. The night blurred into the next morning, then into another night, and still the dancing didn't stop. Cross-dressing was common, celebrated even. Men in nuns' robes, women in knights' armor, children dressed as wolves, old men parading as queens. Bodies were no longer owned, but borrowed, painted, redrawn. Some wore nothing at all, save for mud or garlands. Others wrapped themselves in curtains, cloaks, hay, birds' feathers. Faces were coated with chalk, blood, crushed berries, soot. You could become anyone, anything. A horse, a ghost, a saint with 7 noses. No one asked questions. No one took offense. Because for these few days, nothing was real. Identity itself became a costume to be worn and shed. And beneath the masks, people did things they would never confess. Kissed those they feared, danced with those they hated, laughed beside those they envied. It wasn't safe. But it was free. Then came the end. The fire burned low. The masks were peeled off, sticky with sweat. The barrels were empty. The sausages gone. People slept in doorways or stumbled into churches with ash on their faces. Carnival did not leave quietly. It collapsed. It bled into morning with headaches and bruises and sudden silences. And then, as if coordinated by some invisible hand, the fasting began. The priests re-emerged. The sermons returned. The confessions piled up like broken shoes. But something remained. A whisper. A memory. A grin behind the veil. For 3 days, the world had belonged to no one. There had been no rules, no walls, no guilt, just color, chaos, and the terrifying thrill of being truly alive. And even as ashes were rubbed into foreheads and bells tolled for repentance, somewhere, someone was already sewing a new mask for next year. The banners flapped in the wind, bright with saints and relics, embroidered with verses and holy blessings. Beneath them, incense curled into the sky, and monks in brown habits chanted litanies while pilgrims knelt in the dust. The church fair had begun. It was a sacred occasion, technically, a time to venerate bones, buy indulgences, pray for the dead, and remember the weight of salvation. But as the crowd thickened and the sun climbed higher, the line between piety and pleasure grew thinner. Stalls sprang up like mushrooms, selling candles, yes, but also pastries shaped like genitalia, dice carved from bone, and charms to protect against infertility or impotence. A juggler performed beside a friar preaching about hell. The air smelled of wax and roast pork. And behind the chapel, beyond the last row of relics, there was always a tent with no sign. But everyone knew what it was. The church turned a blind eye. Officially, the fair was holy. Unofficially, it funded repairs, fed mouths, paid debts. The money changed hands quickly and quietly. The bishop might scowl at the dancing girls, but still take his cut from the stall that sold painted eggs and aphrodisiacs. Children chased each other with toy swords while their parents haggled over relics of questionable origin. Splinters of the true cross, feathers from Gabriel's wings, milk from the Virgin's breast. It was hard to say whether anyone believed in the objects. But belief wasn't always the point. They bought what they needed: hope, distraction, pleasure. And when the needs were more carnal, there was always someone nearby, offering comfort for a price. The whores didn't wear veils. They wore bells on their ankles, ribbons in their hair, and smiles that knew how this worked. No one pretended to be shocked. The same hands that clutched rosaries by day clutched hips by night. Behind the chapel, in a fenced courtyard or hidden stall, the business continued. It wasn't always secret. Some fairs had entire zones for it. Rows of painted wagons, tents with low doors, and girls who sang hymns as jokes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. One might hear a sermon about purity while watching a couple disappear behind a curtain 3 stalls away. Drunken minstrels played tunes too lewd for the cathedral, and nuns passed by without pausing. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't outrage either. The fairs were a release valve, an acknowledgement that sin didn't vanish just because it was Sunday. Better to contain it here, where it could be taxed, watched, and confined. Some clergy even visited those tents, faces hidden beneath cloaks, leaving silver behind and guilt outside the flap. The women didn't ask names, the men didn't give them, but both knew the rules of the game. And when morning came, everyone returned to the stalls, to the relics, to the prayers. As the fair wound down, the tents came down too. The bones were packed away, the dancers vanished, the brothel carts rolled off toward the next village, and the church resumed its silence. But the memory lingered, of smoke, of laughter, of bodies and bells. It wasn't a scandal, it was a pattern. Year after year, shrine after shrine, the same convergence of holiness and hunger. Some said it was hypocrisy, others called it balance. But no one denied that the fairs worked. They drew crowds, they stirred hearts, they emptied purses and filled pews. And if a soul left lighter, whether from prayer or pleasure, wasn't that, in the end, still a kind of grace? The chapel was full to bursting, not because of a holy day or a funeral, but because word had spread. Father Benoit had been drinking again. Not just a cup of wine for the nerves or a small toast in the rectory, but enough to turn his Latin into a limerick and his steps into a wobble. The villagers didn't mind. In fact, they came early to get the best seats, children perched on windowsills. Housewives in kerchiefs crowded the aisles. Even the reeve, who normally slept through Mass, leaned forward with a grin. They all waited for that moment when the priest would stumble, clear his throat, and begin a blessing, not from Scripture, but from wherever his wine-addled brain decided to wander. Sometimes it rhymed, sometimes it didn't. Once he blessed a chicken by name. Once he called the Virgin Mary our sweet lady of the barley loaf. It was chaos. It was ridiculous. And it was beloved. The altar boys, seasoned veterans by now, had learned to guide him gently through the motions. They'd hide the third chalice of wine. They'd nudge him back to the center when he drifted too far to one side. And when he forgot the Nicene Creed and instead offered a rhymed couplet about rain, sin, and turnips, they simply rang the bell and moved on. The congregation roared with laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the affectionate kind. Because Father Benoit, despite his faults, was theirs. He had baptized their babies, buried their parents, blessed their livestock. And on feast days, especially after the wine had flowed, he became something more than a priest. He became the village fool in robes, the holy jester, the sacred drunk who reminded everyone that even God must sometimes laugh. His slurred benedictions might not save souls, but they warmed hearts. And in a world of plague, taxes, and silence, warmth was worth more than doctrine. The church disapproved, of course. Higher-ups sent letters. Once they dispatched a canon from the city to observe. He left after half an hour, appalled by the sight of a priest preaching in verse and blessing a piglet dressed in baby clothes. He threatened to report it to the bishop. But the villagers stood firm. They penned a collective letter insisting that Father Benoit's eccentricities were not evidence of heresy, but proof of his connection to the people. He speaks in the language of the heart, they wrote, and if the heart sometimes rhymes, that is no crime. The bishop, either amused or indifferent, never responded. And so the tradition continued. Each festival, each midsummer mass, each harvest feast, the chapel filled with expectation, not of solemnity, but of joy. The kind of joy that made old men slap their knees and young girls hide their giggles behind hymnals. In the end, it was never about doctrine. It was about permission. Permission to laugh, to stumble, to be ridiculous for a few hours in a world that was rarely kind. Father Benoit gave that permission not by command, but by example. He reminded them that holiness didn't always require stillness or silence. Sometimes it required slurred rhymes, off-key songs, and the courage to make a fool of oneself in front of the altar. And when the final blessing came, whether it was sung, whispered, or half-spoken through hiccups, the people crossed themselves with real affection. Not because they believed the words were perfect, but because they believed the man meant them. And perhaps, just perhaps, God did too. The road into town turned to dust by mid-morning, kicked up by cartwheels and the tramp of hundreds of feet. Long before you saw the stalls, you heard them. The shouts of merchants hawking goods in every language. The clatter of iron tools on wooden tables. The sudden laughter of a child chasing a wooden hoop through strangers' legs. The fair had arrived. For 1 week, maybe less, the world turned sideways. Bakers from other villages set up ovens in wagons. Itinerant tailors displayed bolts of cloth that shimmered like royalty. Tooth pullers twirled their tongs. Actors shrieked in mock agony, and jugglers made knives dance in the air. And everywhere, there was meat. Roasted over coals, smoked on spits, stuffed into pies, skewered with herbs. The air was thick with its grease and promise. It was impossible to pass through the square without biting into something or losing a coin. The fair wasn't just for trade. It was for spectacle. A man with no tongue claimed to tell fortunes by touch. A woman led a bear on a leash, dressed in bells. There were puppet shows that mocked kings and mimes who mimed being hanged. A man in a blue hood demonstrated a flying machine made of feathers and wine fumes, and only broke his leg when it collapsed from the roof. Another man sold bottles labeled "Cure for Cowardice" that smelled suspiciously like vinegar and rum. Everyone knew most of it was nonsense. No one cared. The illusion was part of the price. Children ran wild, tripping over bundles of furs and nearly falling into buckets of eels. Lovers disappeared behind tents. Thieves mingled with pilgrims. Everyone bargained, shouted, gestured. And when evening came, torches lit up the dust, turning the air golden. The smell of animals mixed with perfume and sweat. Music played from 5 different directions at once. And still the fair pulsed forward as if it might never end. The town itself bent around the fair. Doors opened that were usually shut. The Lord, if he had any sense, stayed quiet and let the noise rise. The church tried to maintain a presence, erecting a wooden cross near the entrance, and offering indulgences for sale beside a relic that may or may not have been a saint's knuckle. But even the priests knew better than to preach too loudly. No one came to repent. They came to forget. The fair allowed things that other days forbade. You could drink too much, flirt too boldly, argue too loudly. You could buy lace you didn't need or a charm to ward off death, knowing full well it was made from pigeon bones. Some vendors promised to return next year. Others vanished before the fair ended, taking their tents and promises with them. But no one held grudges. That was part of it too, the fleetingness. The fair arrived suddenly, dazzled, overwhelmed, and disappeared before the town could grow tired of it. And when it was gone, the silence felt strange. The dust still hung in the air. A ribbon or a broken doll might linger in the gutter. The square felt bigger, emptier. People returned to their chores, their debts, their duties, but they walked differently, as if some thread of music still hummed beneath their feet. Children played fair for days afterward, mimicking the cries of merchants and pretending to juggle. Housewives saved coins in secret, just in case the peddler with the blue spices came back. And men remembered the taste of cider, the flash of silk, the sound of laughter rising above the crowd. It hadn't been real, but it had been needed. A breath, a break, a shared story. And next year, or maybe sooner, it would come again. Not quite the same, never long enough, but always just in time. They came on carts, always creaking, always late, drawn by mules or donkeys that looked as worn as their masters. The players, thin men with thick voices, women with painted cheeks, boys who knew when to cry and when to steal, rolled into town and transformed the square into a stage. Nothing was needed but a plank, a curtain, and a little rope. And suddenly, the Virgin Mary was weeping over a puppet Christ. St. George was slaying a dragon made of barrels and soot, and devils were leaping from trapdoors in the ground. Children screamed. Adults crossed themselves, then laughed. The show was crude, but no one cared. It wasn't about accuracy. It was about movement, color, rhythm. The saints walked again. The sinners burned in paper flames, and for half an hour, salvation felt real and oddly entertaining. Between the passion plays came jugglers, barefoot, shirtless, slick with sweat and wine. They juggled apples, knives, torches, anything they could steal or borrow. Some of them spoke in riddles, others in rhymes, and a few in pure nonsense. One could balance a stool on his chin while standing on one leg. Another juggled 9 turnips while mocking the mayor's haircut. The crowd roared. Coins flew. Children tried to mimic them and knocked over chickens. No one minded. These weren't just entertainers. They were messengers from a world where logic bent and wonder ruled. They could mock the church, flatter the Lord, and insult the audience in a single breath, and somehow be loved for it. Their art was movement, their tool was chaos, and when they slipped, when a torch fell or a joke landed flat, they laughed louder than anyone else. The puppet masters were perhaps the most mysterious. Hunched men with crooked teeth and nimble fingers, they worked from behind curtained booths, speaking in 6 voices and giving life to wood and cloth. Their stories ranged from sacred to scandalous. One might depict the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, his puppet body pierced by actual sewing needles. Another might tell the tale of a baker who made a pact with the devil for softer dough. The crowd, rapt, swayed between laughter and horror. Sometimes the puppets argued with each other. Sometimes they argued with the audience. The line between script and improvisation vanished. A rainstorm could stop a priest's sermon, but not a puppet's. They would perform under cloaks, beneath awnings, or right through the downpour if the crowd stayed. And the crowd always stayed. Of course, not every show succeeded. Sometimes the stage collapsed, or a performer forgot his lines, or a fight broke out over a stolen purse mid-performance. Once, a devil's mask caught fire and singed the hair off the actor playing God. Once, a puppet of Judas hanged itself so violently the whole booth toppled. But these failures only added to the myth. They were traveling miracles and minor disasters, patched together with laughter and string. They didn't promise perfection. They promised presence. For an hour or two, dusty villagers became audiences. Peasants became judges. Children became saints. And the saints, wooden, greasy, clumsy saints, became human again. The show would end. The carts would creak away. But something lingered, like the echo of applause in an empty square. A reminder that once, for a moment, the holy and the ridiculous had danced side by side, and no one had looked away. The music began before the sun slipped behind the rooftops, long before the candles were lit, or the pigs were carved. It started with a drum, just one, thudding in the distance like a heartbeat someone had dragged out of the earth. Then came the pipes, thin and reedy, fluttering like birds, and then a string, plucked so sharply it felt like a jolt to the spine. No one called for dancing. No one announced it. But it happened. A child leapt into the square, bare feet slapping the dust, arms flailing in time to nothing. Another joined, then a woman, then two men who'd been drinking since noon. Soon there were dozens. Shoes were forgotten. Partners didn't matter. There was no pattern, no rehearsal, only motion. The kind of motion that grew from hunger, from heat, from the long silence of fields and prayers and rules. Some danced with their eyes closed, spinning until the world vanished. Some laughed while they moved, grabbing the air as if trying to shake hands with the sky. There was no melody anyone could hum. It bent and stretched, quickened and broke, and still they followed. It wasn't elegant. There were no dainty steps, no careful bows. It was messy, loud, clumsy, and full of joy. A man stomped so hard he cracked a plank. A girl slipped and laughed so hard she forgot to get up. Dust swirled around their legs. Sweat shone on foreheads. The drummers didn't stop. The pipers didn't tire. Someone brought torches, and their light made the dancers into shadows, long-limbed and impossible, flailing in ways that no one would dare by daylight. No one watched. Or rather, everyone watched, but no one judged. To watch was to be part of it, and to be part of it was to remember, for once, how it felt to move without fear. It didn't matter who you were. The baker's apprentice spun beside the blacksmith's wife. The shoeless beggar danced behind the reeve's son. No one led. No one followed. It wasn't a courtly dance, the kind done in stone halls where each movement meant something. This meant nothing. Or perhaps it meant everything. A chance to be a body, nothing more. A body that had survived another season, another tax, another burial, another betrayal. A body that still ached but hadn't broken. They danced for saints. They danced for ghosts. They danced for the sake of dancing. Sometimes it turned frenzied. A boy would shout. A woman would cry out. Someone would fall, get up, fall again. The music didn't soften. It insisted. It pulled. Even those who swore they'd never dance found themselves swaying, first in secret, then in public, until they too were caught in the storm. And then, as suddenly as it began. It ended. One by one, the instruments ceased. The feet slowed. The breath returned, ragged and heavy. The square was quiet again, but different. Something had changed, even if no one said it. They returned to their places, benches, barrels, shadows. The fire crackled. Someone handed out cups. Someone kissed someone else without asking. There was no applause. There was only stillness and a kind of shared exhaustion that felt cleaner than any sermon. Tomorrow would return with its weight. The fields, the debts, the silences. But tonight, for a little while, they had danced. Without instruction, without permission, without consequence. Just bodies in motion, dust in the air, and music that felt like mercy. They gathered where the shouting was loudest. Not for sermons, not for songs, but for something cruder, something stickier, something that left feathers in your teeth and a grin on your face. In one corner of the square, two roosters, oily, furious, drugged with noise and sun, pecked at each other with blind hatred. They weren't just birds anymore. They were avatars of every insult ever swallowed, every hunger ever borne. Bets flew louder than feathers. Men shouted names like spells. Children stood on tiptoes, eyes wide, trying to see past the shoulders of farmers and blacksmiths. The fights didn't last long, but long enough to leave scratches on the soul. When it was over, one bird proud, the other crumpled. There was a moment of silence. Then came the clapping, and laughter, and coins changing hands. Some whispered that it was cruel. Most didn't whisper at all. Not far away, a different kind of violence played out. This one staged, rehearsed, but no less beloved. A makeshift stage, a few painted backdrops, and a troupe of actors with more courage than skill. Their weapon was the slap. Their armor was absurdity. A man in a bonnet chased another in a doublet, both shrieking in falsetto, neither making sense. They tripped over barrels, poked each other with wooden swords, and fell over backwards every 5 lines. The audience howled. This wasn't theater for the court. This was for the muddy, hungry, work-hardened crowd who wanted something loud, fast, and a little obscene. Someone always got hit with a pie. Someone always moaned about love in a voice like a goat. And someone always emerged in underclothes, to the delight of 10-year-olds and drunkards alike. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. And then there was the goose. Always the goose. Tied to a rope, strung from a line between 2 poles, wings flapping, eyes wild. The contest was simple. Ride past on horseback and try to tear the bird free with your bare hands. The winner took the goose. The loser took the mud. People argued about whether the goose should be dead first. Some towns insisted on it. Others didn't care. The spectacle was what mattered. The splash, the shriek, the twist of feathers in the sun. It didn't matter that the prize was greasy and panicked. What mattered was the attempt, the laughter, the absurdity. And for those watching, it was just another ritual. Brutal, yes, but also strangely bonding. Men shouted advice they didn't follow. Women screamed with glee. Children mimed the whole thing with sticks and invisible birds. These weren't noble entertainments. They weren't refined. But they were beloved in ways no hymn or ballad could match. They belonged to the people, not to the clergy, not to the court, not to the chroniclers who scribbled about wars and kings. They belonged to those who worked with their hands, who lived with dirt under their nails and bruises on their shins. They didn't ask for meaning. They didn't pretend to teach. They only offered release, a place to laugh too loudly, to cheer for a chicken, to groan at a pratfall, to reach for a goose and fall into a puddle. And in a world that was often cold, rigid, and ruled by fear, that kind of silliness wasn't just fun. It was sacred. The bones clattered against the wood like tiny thunderclaps. Not real bones most of the time, just bits of carved ivory, stone, or even sheep knuckles blackened from use. But the name stuck. Bones. They clicked and bounced, spun and settled, and with them rose the hearts and fell the fortunes of men who had nothing left to lose. There was always a game going somewhere, behind the tavern, in a corner of the fairground, or crouched beneath a market stall after dark. The rules shifted from village to village, even from table to table, but the thrill never changed. Each roll was a prayer, a taunt, a punishment, and a promise all at once. The thrower's eyes followed the bones like a starving man watches bread. Silence, then cheer, or cursing, or worse. The gods rarely answered, but the dice always did. Wagers varied. Some risked pennies, others cloaks. A man once bet his shoes and walked home barefoot through frost. Another lost a pig and spent the rest of the evening drunk on stolen cider, laughing like he'd just been crowned. It wasn't just about the winnings. It was about the moment. The breathless pause before the dice fell, the crowd leaning in, the sharp inhale of hope. They said the Virgin herself watched over gamblers, though she never interfered. They said the devil played too, dressed as a monk or a merchant, laughing hardest when a man lost everything. No one really believed it, but no one really didn't. In a world where saints bled and relics wept, the line between sacred and profane was as thin as the edge of a coin. Sometimes the game grew violent. A man accused another of cheating. A blade flashed. Blood hit the boards where the dice still lay, showing 7. The rest scattered, the bones forgotten. But by the next evening, the board would be back, the players too. Addiction wasn't a word they used, but everyone understood the feeling. That need to tempt fate, to see the world spin out of your hands for a moment, to shout when you win, to groan when you lose, and to keep going either way. It was a kind of madness, but a familiar one, a shared madness. And sometimes, on rare nights when the throws came just right, it felt like communion, sacred, ecstatic, and utterly pointless. No church condoned it, but even priests were known to play when no one was watching. No law forbade it outright, but more than one man ended up in the stocks with a dice cup around his neck. The bones were honest, brutal but honest. They didn't care about your title or your trade. They didn't care if your children were hungry or your debts unpaid. They only danced and fell and told the truth you didn't want to hear. And still, they played. Because for a moment, you weren't a peasant or a thief or a servant. You were a gambler, equal to all. And in that flicker of chaos, when the bones flew and the world held its breath, you felt something almost divine. Not hope, not mercy, just the thrill of chance, sharp as wine and twice as dangerous. The longest day was behind them, but the light hadn't gone. It lingered like a whisper, clinging to the grass and glinting in the smoke that curled into the evening sky. The bonfire stood tall, taller than any man, built from branches hauled from the forest, scraps from the field, even old tools too cracked for use. Children darted around its base while the elders muttered charms and warnings. When it finally lit, sputtering, flaring, roaring, there was a moment of reverence, then a rush of cheers. This wasn't just fire. It was the fire of Ivanov Day, the fire that burned away sickness, bad luck, and last year's regrets. They said if you jumped it, you'd be safe. They said what if you danced near it, your soul would shine. They said a lot of things that night, but no one stopped to write them down. The young were the first to leap, boys with soot on their faces and ale on their breath, girls with bare feet and wildflowers in their hair. Some held hands, some screamed, some tripped and nearly burned, but all of them jumped. The fire didn't judge. It didn't bless either. It simply waited. Behind the flames, others sang. Old songs that knew no words, only sounds and rhythms passed down like heirlooms. The drums were logs. The flutes were reeds. Someone found a bell and rang it until the stars came out. In the shadows, lovers whispered, not promises, just possibilities. Tonight was for trying, for risking, for letting go. The moon rose, but the fire was brighter. It cracked and hissed, and the smoke curled into patterns no priest could explain. Some swore they saw faces, others saw futures. By the river, the water caught the reflection of firelight and turned it into trembling gold. Girls with wreaths walked to the edge, clutching their creations, crowns of herbs and flowers woven with trembling fingers. They kissed them, named them, and let them go. The wreaths floated, spun, drifted. If one came back, it meant the girl would marry late. If it vanished quickly, she'd be wed within the year. If it turned in circles, her love would betray her. No one knew who made the rules, but they all watched. Boys hid in reeds, waiting to catch the wreath of a girl they liked. Sometimes it was planned, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it ended in shouting. But always, it mattered. Because for one night, the river listened, and the future wasn't a burden. It was a game. Midnight came and no one noticed. The air was thick with smoke, laughter, perfume, and sweat. Old women threw herbs into the flames. Young men tied charms to trees. Someone claimed to see a witch on the hill. Someone else kissed someone they shouldn't have. It didn't matter. The world had softened. For a few hours, it wasn't cruel or heavy or distant. It was magic. Real or not, it wrapped around them like warmth. And in the morning, when the ashes cooled and the wreaths were gone and the songs forgotten, they'd remember something. Not the details, but the feeling. The jump, the fire, the kiss, the river, the impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. Not easier, just different. That was enough. That was everything. The night before a feast, or sometimes no feast at all, there were rituals. Not the kind with incense or Latin, but quieter ones, whispered between giggles and half-serious frowns. A girl would go to the garden, not during the day when others could see, but after sunset, when the sky turned the color of old milk and the frogs began their chorus. She'd pick a carrot, not the largest, not the prettiest, just one that felt right. It had to be pulled in silence. It had to be washed in still water. And then it went under the pillow. That was the whole charm. No prayers, no salt circles, no saints invoked. just a vegetable and the hope that the dream it summoned would show her the face of her future husband, or at least his boots, or dog. Dreams were rarely precise. No one remembered where the custom came from. Some said it was pagan. Some said it was a joke. Others swore by it. Old women told stories of how they dreamed of a man with red hair, then married a baker with a copper beard. Others said the trick only worked if the girl fasted, or prayed, or tied a ribbon around her finger. Variations abounded. Some used cabbage instead. Some used onions. But carrots were the most popular, probably because they were easiest to steal from the kitchen. The morning after was always the same. The girls gathered near the well or the oven, or anywhere their mothers weren't. They shared their dreams. "He wore green," one would say. "He had a limp," another whispered. Sometimes the dreams were strange. Headless men, dogs in cloaks, a ring floating in soup. But they always meant something. Or at least, they were made to mean something. There was comfort in the ritual. Not because it was scientific, or sacred, or even logical, but because it was theirs. In a world where fathers chose husbands, where priests gave lectures on obedience, where love was considered a risk at best and a sin at worst, this was something a girl could do alone. A moment of softness before the hardness of marriage. A night to believe in magic, even if it came wrapped in soil and stringy roots. The carrot might end up nibbled by a mouse. The dream might be about her cousin. But for that one night, it was all possibility. And possibility was rare. It was more than romance. It was control, in a way that was gentle, foolish, and profoundly human. Sometimes the dreams came true. Sometimes they didn't. And sometimes the carrot just ended up in the soup. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the ritual itself, the quiet pluck from the earth, the hush of the bedroom, the secret shared in sleep. It was silly, yes, but it was also brave, because it dared to ask for something better, something sweeter. In a time when life was mapped out like a field, plow here, sow there, wed him, bear this. These little acts of defiance masked as nonsense were everything. And maybe that's why the tradition lasted. Not because it worked, but because it gave them a moment to hope. And sometimes, that was more nourishing than the carrot itself. The clouds had vanished weeks ago, leaving the earth cracked and the rivers mean. Wells grew shallow. Bread tasted like dust. And yet, no one blamed the sky, not out loud at least. You could curse the king. You could scold your neighbor. But the sky? That was different. The sky listened. And when it didn't answer, people turned elsewhere. They turned to the ground beneath their feet, to the oldest things they knew, to the rituals passed down like wrinkles and arthritis. That's when the fires started. Not for warmth or war, but for prayer. Flames built high in meadows, along field edges beside dry streams. Not funeral pyres, though the crops were dying. These were calls, invitations, demands. And the people jumped, over and over, barefoot, breathless. Children first, then elders, then all the rest, until the air smelled of sweat and scorched hair and something ancient. Not magic, not quite, just memory in motion. Sometimes it was just fire and feet. Other times, there were words, chants, rhymes, half-remembered verses said backward or whispered to herbs tied with red thread. Rain for rye, not for sin, they might say. Or, Clouds above, roots below, let the water come and go. No one knew who wrote them. No one needed to. They worked, except when they didn't. Then came the other charms. Buckets left out with mirrors inside, meant to shame the sun. Dolls carved from bread, buried in fields with tears and mud. Girls would carry jugs on their heads and walk in silence from one boundary stone to another. Boys would chase frogs through the shallows and call it luck. One widow hung her sheets from the rafters upside down and claimed she dreamed of thunder. And when it rained 3 days later, no one laughed. Not all of it was desperation. Some of it was joy in disguise. The jumping became a game, the chants a chorus. They'd light the fire again even when the rain finally came, this time to thank, not beg. They danced in the puddles, stomped in the muck, laughed when their feet sank too deep to pull free. Rain brought life, but also a kind of giddiness, a reminder that the world hadn't turned entirely against them. And when it didn't come, well, there was still the fire, still the leap, still the sense that doing something, anything, was better than waiting with empty hands. The church might have frowned on it, but the priests were often first to jump, cassocks flying. The monks wrote their disapproval in ink, but even they watched from the cloister windows. It wasn't about belief. It was about belonging. About saying together, "We see you, sky. We won't beg, but we won't give up either." It was an act of defiance, or maybe of patience, or maybe just of weariness made visible. They weren't druids. They weren't fools. They were people who needed bread, who needed barley, who needed to know that their work wasn't just being ground into dust. And if that meant leaping through flame or whispering to trees, so be it. The earth was tired, so were they. But they danced anyway, in circles worn into the dirt, their shadows flickering like spirits, asking the ground to speak louder, so the sky eventually might hear. It began with a name and a date on the church calendar, St. George's Day. But what followed had little in common with silence or sermons. In some towns, it was just another holy day. In others, it was a reason to bring out every scrap of joy they could muster. They sang, not in choirs, but in clusters, half-drunk, red-faced, off-key. Songs about the saint, yes, but also about dragons that looked suspiciously like farm animals draped in old sheets, and princesses played by men with hay-stuffed wigs. They sang while hoisting mugs, while stumbling over cobbles, while waving wooden swords in mock battles that left bruises and laughter. Somewhere in the chaos, the story remained. The saint, the beast, the impossible courage. But it mingled with ale and mischief until it was hard to tell where legend ended and the party began. Children loved it most. Not for the saint, his tail was too clean, but for the performance. They chased the dragon, or were the dragon, or cheered from barrels as it paraded through the street. Someone always wore the armor, often pieced together from kitchen pans and broken tools. Someone else wore scales made from cabbage leaves or dyed linen, and stumbled theatrically while villagers shouted, "Strike, George, strike!" When the final blow came, usually a gentle tap, the crowd erupted. Not because they believed a monster had died, but because the story gave them a rhythm. It gave them a reason to gather, to play, to pretend. And pretending was a kind of hope, that monsters could be beaten, that good men might still win. Food and drink flowed with holy enthusiasm. Breads shaped like swords, meats roasted on open flames, spiced roots wrapped in leaves and handed to children sticky with syrup. Ale ran fast from barrels hammered into wagons. Even the poorest managed a taste. The taverns overflowed. Blessings were traded for beer. In some corners, a priest might mutter a prayer over the crowd. In others, the only holy thing was the way the sun hit the flagon. And yet, in all the mess, mud, songs, splinters, and laughter, there was reverence. Not for relics, but for resilience. They didn't need polished gold to celebrate courage. They just needed the story, retold in crooked voices with ale-fueled conviction. The message got through, if not to heaven, then at least to each other. By nightfall, the dragon lay in tatters. The songs had slurred into lullabies, and the actors were asleep on benches or under carts. But the feeling lingered, that for a day they had joined something bigger than themselves, that they had fought a beast, even if it was make-believe, that they had stood beside a saint, even if barefoot and swaying. In a life built around toil and silence, this noisy, foolish day mattered, not for what it proved, but for what it allowed. The chance to laugh without shame, to believe without fear, and to remember that even in a world full of real monsters, sometimes all you needed was a good story, a wooden sword, and someone to cheer when you swung it. It was not Christmas, not yet, but it was close enough for wonder. St. Nicholas's Day came with cold breath and stiff boots, but also with the warm noise of children laughing too hard to breathe. They were the center of it all. For one morning, or sometimes an entire afternoon, the adults stepped back, and the smallest among them stepped up, into vestments, into authority, into delight. Boys barely tall enough to peer over the altar were dressed in borrowed robes. Their voices squeaked through Latin prayers they didn't understand, and they blessed their elders with such solemnity that even the grumpiest priest had to turn away to hide his grin. And then they laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full collapse of joy, as if the fabric of rules had momentarily torn wide open and let the light in. They were called child bishops, sometimes elected in mock ceremonies that mimicked the real thing. A crooked staff, a paper mitre, a choir of giggles trailing behind. These tiny clerics processed through the town or monastery, waving to cobblers, blessing bakers, tripping on their oversized hems. In some places, the child bishop gave a sermon, often about sweets or mischief, or why bedtime should be abolished. The grown-ups listened or pretended to, and the laughter spread like embers in straw. No one expected theology. What they wanted, what they needed, was the sight of innocence turned ceremonial, of sacred things made soft, of the line between holy and human blurred just enough to let children play. Gifts followed, of course. Small ones, nuts wrapped in cloth, tiny gingerbread men, bits of coin if you were lucky, or a fig if you were not. Shoes left out overnight might be filled with something sweet, or something sour if you had misbehaved, though no one ever really checked. It wasn't about punishment. It was about surprise. About believing that someone somewhere noticed your goodness. Even if that someone was a red-cheeked boy pretending to be a bishop, who took his role very seriously until the sugar kicked in and he ran shouting into the courtyard. Girls weren't always allowed to join in, but they often hovered near, holding up the hems of the robes or whispering lines to the forgetful. And sometimes, quietly, they crowned their own bishop in secret, behind barns or under porches. By the end of the day, the robes were stained, the bread was gone, and the children had collapsed into sleep, their dreams scented with wax and cloves. But the memory of it lingered, especially for the adults, for monks who had once played the part themselves, for mothers who saw their sons in mitres and felt a tug in their chest, for a world so heavy with rules and hardship. The day offered something rare: joy without purpose, laughter without guilt, holiness without fear. St. Nicholas, the real one, might have been watching from stained glass or storybooks, but on this day, it was the children who carried the Spirit, not in miracles or martyrdom, but in mischief, music, and the kind of blessing that came with sticky fingers and hearts too full to hold. There was one day, just one, when the monastery forgot how to frown. The walls still stood tall, the bells still rang, the incense still burned. But the silence broke, and the laughter echoed where prayers usually whispered. It was a strange and beautiful fracture in the year, the Feast of Fools or something like it. No official name was needed. The monks knew it by the shift in the air, the glint in the abbot's eye, the way the rules loosened just enough to let joy through. For a brief time, reverence made room for ridiculousness. It wasn't sacrilege. It was sacred in its own sideways way. Novices performed mock sermons in pig Latin, blessing the chickens and delivering moral lessons to turnips. A brother known for his grim fasting might pretend to lust after a roast duck carried solemnly through the cloister, guarded like a relic. Someone dressed the chapel's statue of St. Peter in a cloak of straw and offered him a bowl of soup. They sang hymns, real ones, but changed the words so that angels wept with laughter, not sorrow. The choir director, normally a terror in sandals, was crowned with a bucket. And yes, sometimes the abbot laughed. Not a restrained smile, not a polite chuckle, but a real, uncontrollable laugh that shook his belly and made the novices forget their place, and then remember it with gratitude. No work was done. Or rather, the work was different. They prepared a feast, poorly. They staged plays, terribly. They imitated one another with exaggerated reverence, mimicking habits and tics so perfectly that even the targets couldn't help but grin. A stern old monk, usually silent at meals, suddenly found himself the subject of an operatic parody, performed by two barefoot novices wielding ladles as scepters. He tried to scowl, then surrendered to mirth. The cloister, usually so disciplined, felt like a tavern, except no one had to pretend to be better than they were. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled collapse, a ritual of unbuttoning. The laughter faded slowly as the sun slipped down and the candles burned lower. Robes were brushed clean, voices softened. The straw cloak was removed from St. Peter. The abbot, still smiling faintly, gave the final benediction with a wink. Tomorrow would bring silence again, and rules, and guilt. But tonight, the brothers had remembered something older than penance. That joy could live even here, among stone walls and psalms. That holiness didn't have to hide from laughter, and that even the most devout heart needed, at least once a year, to let go, not to sin, but to breathe, to laugh, to feel the body shake with something other than fear. And in that shaking, to be reminded that God, too, might have a sense of humor. They didn't have silk or sequins. They had soot and straw, bones and buttons, old wool dyed with crushed berries and prayers. But when the festival came, they stitched together beasts that had never walked the earth, lions with feathers, dragons with patched wings, deer with antlers made from twisted willow. This wasn't a court parade. It wasn't meant to impress nobles or flatter kings. It belonged to the streets, to the children with ash-smudged cheeks, to the beggars who borrowed pots for helmets, to the washerwomen who painted their faces and became something else for an afternoon. It was a parade of the impossible, imagined into being with scraps and hope. They called it many names, depending on the village, the saint, the season. But always it was a procession, staggering, wheezing, glorious. A crocodile made of barrels pulled by ropes, a griffin whose wings drooped by the second turn, a horned thing too absurd to name, ridden by a boy in a tunic 2 sizes too large. They marched to the thump of drums that had once been buckets. They roared through alleyways and wobbled through marketplaces, leaving trails of laughter and straw. The poor watched themselves become myth, and for a while it didn't matter that they'd be scraping the mud tomorrow. Today, they were part of something grander, something too strange to be ordinary. Spectators lined the streets, shouting encouragement or ridicule. It didn't matter which. The performers bowed to both. A man walked bent beneath a wooden horse frame, legs kicking beneath fabric flanks. A girl waved painted feathers from her arms and shrieked like a phoenix. The crowd tossed coins or bread or insults. All were accepted with equal ceremony. Nothing was rehearsed. That was the point. This wasn't about perfection. It was about eruption. About taking all the dull, aching days and turning them inside out. The beasts were crude, ridiculous, falling apart at the seams. But they were alive. Not in the eyes of God or kings, but in the shouts of children and the laughter of bakers with flour on their faces. When the sun dipped low and the last creature limped off stage, the spell didn't break immediately. Bits of costume lingered, feathers stuck in windowsills, hoofprints scuffed into the dust. The people drifted home, still half animal in their hearts. For a moment, they had walked inside their own stories. Not the ones written by monks or sung by bards, but the ones they made themselves, with ash and rags and the stubborn belief that fantasy belonged to them too. The nobles had their tapestries and their falcons. But in the alleys, in the guttering light of evening, a child still wore the head of a paper lion, and no one told him to take it off. They didn't call it heresy. Not allowed. Not when the archdeacon was near. But everyone knew what it was. A puppet with a crooked nose and a mitre too big for its head. A boy with cotton breasts stuffed into his tunic and a crown of lilies drooping over one eye. The crowd roared. The puppet pope stumbled across the stage, blessing pigs and misquoting Latin. The Virgin tossed breadcrumbs to the drunkards in the front row. It was obscene. It was outrageous. And it was necessary. For one night, or one afternoon, in the right season, the sacred became ridiculous, and the people were allowed to laugh at the things that usually made them tremble. It wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't entirely secret either. These performances happened in side alleys during festivals, after too much wine, or behind barns at the edge of town. They used the same tropes again and again: mock sermons, crude miracles, a pope who farted incense, a holy maiden with too many suitors. It was dirty, clever, and dangerously close to being true. The actors were often the same ones who sang in church or cleaned the sacristy. Their laughter wasn't rebellion. It was relief. A way to touch the divine without being crushed by it. They knew their place, but once a year, they dragged God down into the mud with them, just long enough to feel human again. These plays didn't ask permission. They asked forgiveness after the fact, and rarely received it. but still they persisted. Because the world was absurd, and sometimes the only sane response was to make fun of it. A bishop might thunder from the pulpit the next morning, condemning the previous night's spectacle, but he couldn't stop it. No one could. The jokes were older than the cathedral. The urge to mock authority, even sacred authority, was part of survival. You prayed with one hand and made shadow puppets with the other. You feared the wrath of God, yes, but you also needed to laugh at his representatives, at their gold, their robes, their endless solemnity, because otherwise, it all became too heavy. By dawn, the burlesque was gone. The costumes stuffed into baskets. The stage collapsed. The actors scattered. But the memory lingered. A whispered punchline behind the altar. A knowing glance during Mass. It didn't destroy faith. It made space inside it. It reminded the people that even the holiest stories could be worn thin with repetition, and that laughter might be the most honest kind of worship. Not every year saw a performance. Some years, the weather was too cold or the bishop too cruel. But when it did happen, when the puppet pope raised his hand and accidentally smacked himself in the face, people felt something lift, just for a moment. And that moment was enough to carry them through the rest of the year. She stood at the center of the circle, torchlight dancing across her cheeks, wearing a veil woven from nettles and smoke. The villagers had always called her Saint Martha during the daylight festivals, a girl chosen for her quiet manner, her neat braids, her ability to look solemn on command. But tonight, on the eve of the harvest, she was no longer the holy woman in white. Tonight, she was the witch. Draped in torn shawls and crowned with twigs, she shrieked and howled, cursed the crops and blessed the wolves, and the people roared with laughter, not because they didn't believe, but because for once they could play with fear instead of being ruled by it. This wasn't blasphemy. Not really. It was tradition, deep-rooted and whispered about, older than the church and tolerated only because it made the rest of the year more bearable. The festival needed a villain, and who better than the saint herself, flipped inside out for a single night. Children chased her through the square, pelting her with dry apples and laughter. The local priest looked away. Everyone knew the ritual would end with a mock trial, a playful exorcism, or perhaps a symbolic dunk in the river. But until then, the saint-turned-witch reigned supreme, spitting nonsense spells, stealing shoes, demanding honey cakes and bad poems in exchange for safe dreams. There was something liberating in the reversal. All year long, girls were told to behave like saints, obedient, pure, silent. But tonight, the girl in the veil screamed. She stomped. She danced in a circle of bones and onion skins. No one punished her. No one told her to hush. Her friends cheered from the edges, watching their classmate become something powerful and frightening, and not just in the way men feared a woman's mouth. In this parody of danger, she became untouchable. The old women nodded. They remembered doing the same. The festival didn't erase the chains, but it gave them slack, for one night only. By morning, she would be back in her apron, hands red from washing. The veil would be burned, the ashes scattered in the garden. No one would speak of what she'd done, except in riddles or teasing songs. But the magic remained, faint as the scent of smoke in her hair. She'd touched something wild, and the village had allowed it. Not to free her, not forever, but to keep her sane. To keep them all sane. And though she'd wear white again next year, she would remember the howl in her throat. And that memory would make the silence a little easier to bear. The smell hit first, thick, golden, and warm. Honey warming over coals, spiced nuts roasting in clay pans, and somewhere nearby something rich and sticky bubbling in a pot. It was the kind of scent that stopped people mid-step, drew them from stalls and doorways. On ordinary days, meals were thin things, porridge without sweetness, bread without softness, meat only when the gods were generous or the chickens unlucky. But on festival days, something shifted. The same kitchens, the same hands, and yet the food became alive. There were almonds wrapped in pastry, dates stuffed with cheese, honey cakes shaped like animals, and sausages boiled in cider. Every region had its own treasures, and most of them appeared only once a year, just enough to be remembered, but never enough to become familiar. Children learned the calendar through flavor. They didn't know saints by their miracles, but by the sweets that accompanied them. St. Lucia's buns with saffron, St. Martin's goose dripping with grease, St. Brigid's milk pudding and blessed butter. Grandmothers hoarded recipes as if they were relics, only unrolling them when the church bells signaled something holy. And no one questioned the effort. A holiday meant hours grinding spices, kneading dough, watching the fire with careful eyes so the syrup didn't burn. Because the first taste would be shared in silence, reverent and slow. Even the poorest homes scraped together flour and honeycomb, or a pinch of cinnamon from a merchant cousin. A child might go hungry 3 nights in a row, but on the 4th, they'd eat something unforgettable and wait another year to taste it again. Adults remembered their own childhoods through the tongue. The nut pies that stuck to the roof of the mouth, the caraway seeds that made you cough, the sugared rose petals that felt like eating perfume. Some flavors brought back grief because the hands that once made them were now bones under the chapel floor. Others brought back shame or longing or laughter. Food had memory, and festive food had magic. There were stories of meat that made you dream, of cakes baked with favors inside, of bowls so sweet they softened tempers and sparked marriages. Even the priests admitted, in quiet moments, that a well-fed crowd sinned less, or at least sinned with a full belly and better intentions. By midnight, the table would be empty, the bones picked clean, the pans scorched and sticky. Children slept with fingers still sticky from plum syrup. Adults leaned back, drunk on mead and memory, smiling without knowing why. The feast would not return tomorrow. The ovens would cool. The spices would be locked away. But for that one evening, the world had tasted like celebration. And for weeks afterward, someone would sigh at a crust of stale bread and say, "Remember the feast?" And someone else would nod, mouth already watering, and whisper, "Only 3 more months." The fish had no scales left, no eyes, no tail. But it had a crown, a delicate one, shaped from golden dough, glistening with egg wash and pressed with tiny patterns, a leaf here, a bead there. Inside the pastry, the flesh steamed gently, holding in herbs, lemon peel, and the faintest tray of something peppery. It was Lent, or perhaps Advent, or just another of the church's hungry seasons. Meat was forbidden, and dairy frowned upon. But hunger didn't mean dullness. In the kitchens of monasteries and manor houses alike, cooks grew clever. They molded food into forms it had no right to take. Eels masquerading as sausages, peas pureed into mock caviar, and fish, simple, lean fish, transformed into crowned jewels of the feast table. The art lay in the illusion. Guests gasped when the fish appeared, whole and golden, resting on a bed of greens, flanked by lemons and little pickled onions like pearls. Some would applaud, others would reach for knives, eager to slice through the crust and watch the steam unfurl like incense. The crust, thick enough to hold its shape but thin enough to crack with a crunch, broke apart to reveal the white flesh underneath, soaked with buttered broth and flecked with thyme. Even the church elders, who were meant to frown on excess, found ways to nod approvingly. After all, the rules had been kept. There was no flesh of beasts, only fish, and bread, and joy. Among the peasants, the same spirit took root with humbler means. A carp, caught from a muddy stream, would be laid on a slab and cleaned with care. The dough might be coarse, made from barley or rye, but it would still be shaped, sometimes not into crowns, but into suns or saints or boats. Children helped, carving eyes with dull knives or pressing beans into the crust as jewels. It wasn't just about eating, it was about spectacle. The meal became a ritual, a story told through shape and scent, and when the fish was gone, the bones gleaming like relics, the crust crumbs were gathered and thrown to birds as a kind of blessing. Nothing wasted, not the food, not the joy. These dishes weren't made every week. Some weren't made more than once a year. But they left marks. In the memory, in the stories passed from one kitchen to another. Some said there was a cook who baked a fish in the shape of St. Peter's boat and filled it with grapes. Others swore they'd seen a fish with wings, carved from pastry and brushed with honey. Most agreed that even in the leanest seasons, people needed beauty. A feast wasn't always about plenty. Sometimes it was about making one thing look like a miracle. And in the Middle Ages, miracles were rare, but sometimes they tasted like fish beneath a golden crown. The first sip was always a surprise. Sweet like summer, soft like honey on the tongue. But then it changed. The warmth turned to heat, the sweetness to fire. It crawled down the throat, into the belly, and then bloomed outward like a second sun. Faces flushed, ears rang, and someone somewhere that always coughed. But no one stopped. The mug was passed around again and again, each drink deeper, heavier, until laughter spilled faster than words. This was not the wine of nobles or the beer of the city. This was mead, thick, potent, golden, and wild, brewed in barns, in cellars, in monastery outbuildings, and village huts. It was both gift and weapon. Mead didn't soothe, it struck. And that was the point. At feasts, it pooled in jugs so heavy 2 hands were needed. Monks blessed it, soldiers hoisted it, farmers drank it until the ground tilted sideways. No one knew exactly how strong it was, because no one measured. Mead obeyed the flowers, the bees, the season. A spring batch might leave you dancing. A winter batch might leave you on the floor. Still, they drank. During weddings, at wakes, in holy days and harvests, it was there, golden, bubbling, catching the light like stained glass. It wasn't just about the drink. It was about loosening something. Words. Fear. The cold. A room full of people, silent and stiff, could become a chorus of fools after just a few mugs. Sometimes joy needs a push. Mead gave a shove. There were stories, of course, of a man who drank so much he mistook a goat for his wife, or of a nun who giggled through vespers after sipping from the wrong jug. One tale told of a knight who challenged a barrel to a duel and lost. These weren't warnings. They were traditions. Proof that mead wasn't just drink. It was a spirit, a trickster, a companion. Children weren't allowed near it, but they watched, wide-eyed, as their parents transformed. A quiet mother would sing, a bitter uncle would dance. For a few hours, everyone forgot their aches, their debts, their winter stores. They laughed with mouths stained golden, sweat on their brows and crumbs in their beards. And then, of course, came the fall. Some fell asleep, head on the table, still smiling. Others fell out of doors and into ditches. In the morning, the sweetness would turn sour, the laughter dull. But even that was part of it. Mead wasn't meant to be gentle. It was meant to be alive. And in a world where so much was cold and rigid, this burning honey was a kind of rebellion, a drink that remembered the summer even in the heart of winter, a drink that hurt just enough to remind you that you were still here, still breathing, still able to laugh. Sometimes, that was all anyone needed. In the grand hall, the feast had already stretched into its third hour. Platters had come and gone, roasted boar with cloves in its snout, trenchers soaked with dripping gravy, stews thick enough to eat with fingers. The air was heavy with heat and meat and laughter, but the moment came, as it always did, when everything quieted. It wasn't planned, not exactly, but everyone seemed to know. The servants re-entered, heads bowed, arms trembling slightly under the weight of an enormous pie. The crust was golden, too perfect, almost glowing in the torchlight. No one breathed. The knife descended, and the lid was lifted, and then chaos. From within the pie, birds erupted. Real, flapping, panicked birds, doves or larks or something smaller, fluttered into the air, beating their wings against beams and banners. People screamed, ducked, laughed. One bird landed in a goblet, another on a noblewoman's wig. The pie had been hollow, of course, a stage more than a dish, but for a moment, it had felt like a spell. These tricks weren't new. In noble courts, food was theater. And not just for royalty, anyone who could afford the ingredients and the help might attempt some version of it. There were castles where entire scenes were recreated in sugar, knights on horseback, dragons with almond scale skin, castles with candied glass windows. There were cakes with fountains inside, meat molded to resemble fish, fish dyed to look like rubies. But sometimes the most powerful magic was the smallest. A rose sculpted from boiled sugar, pale pink, edges curling just so. Placed on a trencher beside a custard, it seemed to breathe. And no one wanted to eat it. They would stare, smile, ask if it was real, touch it once softly, and then pull their hand back, afraid to break it. Eventually, someone would. A bite, a crunch, a surprise. And just like that, the spell was gone. But it had worked. Not everyone loved these tricks. Some muttered that it was wasteful, sinful, arrogant. Food was meant to feed. These were games for the rich, the bored, the vain. But even the critics leaned in when the dishes arrived. Everyone wanted to see, to wonder, to feel, if only briefly, that something impossible had just happened. For peasants and laborers, the stories of such dishes spread like legends. A boy might dream of the pie with birds. A girl might imagine tasting the sugar flour. Bakers in villages tried their own versions. Bread shaped like animals, cakes with nuts hidden inside like treasure. The magic spread, changed shape, became something shared. The cooks behind these wonders were part magician, part engineer, part poet. They boiled sugar until it turned glassy, blew it like glassmakers into bubbles and domes. They stitched together skin and meat with thread and cunning. They timed everything to the second, because one moment too long in the oven and the bird inside the pie would be a corpse, not a miracle. And when it worked, it didn't just feed, it stunned. It reminded everyone just for a moment that joy could come from flour and fat and fire, that surprise could live in a bowl, that the line between hunger and wonder wasn't so thick after all. It was theater, yes, but it was also hope, a slice of something beautiful in a world that rarely offered beauty, a laugh that rose from the belly, light and unforced, a shared moment that would be remembered long after the hunger had returned. No one ever prepared for the last day. It wasn't on the posters or in the songs. It arrived like a guest that stayed too long, silent, awkward, heavy. The streets were no longer paved with music and feet, but with empty paper cups, broken ribbons, and the faint smell of things that had once been warm. Vendors packed their wares without smiling. The same hands that threw petals into the air now gathered trash into tired sacks. And people, those same people who had sung and laughed and danced until their bodies ached, now walked slowly, deliberately, their eyes on the ground, as if looking for something they'd dropped and couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness, not really. It was something older, something built into the bones, a return to the ordinary, and the strange discomfort that came with remembering that joy is always temporary. The jugglers were the first to go. Their painted faces looked absurd. Morning light, half melted, half forgotten. One of them dropped a ball and didn't bother picking it up. The musicians followed, their lutes and fiddles wrapped in cloth, silent as coffins. The taverns no longer spilled laughter onto the streets. They leaked groans, hangovers, debts. Church bells rang, but not for celebration. They rang like reminders. The priest's voice echoed through an almost empty nave, his sermon flat, tired, rehearsed. Even the birds seemed quieter. A boy tried to sell leftover honey cakes from a basket, but his calls were hollow and no one turned. Not because they didn't want sweetness, but because it reminded them the feast had already ended. Some banners still fluttered on doorways, forgotten or left in denial. A garland hung on a windowsill, its flowers curling inward. A mask lay face down in the mud. Someone had carved a swan from butter, and placed it on a pedestal during the celebration. Now it sagged, deformed by the sun, a grotesque echo of beauty. A girl approached it with reverence, as if it still meant something, then turned away. On a wall, chalk drawings of saints and dragons faded as the wind licked the stone clean. Children kicked at confetti, then stopped, unsure if they were allowed to keep playing. They looked to the adults for answers, but the adults were already gone, inward, distant, back in the shadows of work and debt and cold stone rooms where the fire had long since burned out. By afternoon, the carnival was only a rumor. Carts creaked under the weight of leftover goods and unsold hope. Men with tired faces rolled up rugs that once held performers. Women gathered costumes and stored them in chests that would not open again until next year, if there was a next year. The jesters and fools wiped off their paint, revealing ordinary skin beneath. And in that transformation was a kind of grief. For a moment, they had been more than themselves. Now they were simply poor again. A man leaned against a wall and wept, not loudly, not for attention. Just a few tears for no clear reason, like his body was emptying out the last of the wine. The sky darkened too early, as if it too had lost the will to shine. And when the wind blew, it carried no music, only the scent of old ashes and flattened grass. This is what the end of celebration looked like. Not a curtain falling, but a slow forgetting. No one announced the final act. It simply faded into nothing, like a dream you struggle to recall after waking. And yet, beneath all that stillness, something lingered. A shared memory, like smoke that clings to a coat. People would talk of it in weeks to come. Remember the fire breather? Remember the woman who walked the tightrope with a rooster on her head? They would laugh, but only briefly, and only to soften the silence. Because once the feast was over, all that remained was the long stretch of days ahead. Days of hunger, of toil, of scraping candle wax from old holders. Days where the only music was the rhythm of a hoe hitting dry earth, or the distant cough of a neighbor in the dark. And still, they would wait for it again. That was the cruel wonder of it all. They knew the celebration would end. They knew it would leave them poorer, exhausted, sometimes even sick. But they would dream of it regardless. The color, the heat, the noise, the wild, absurd defiance of misery, that was the part that stayed. Even as they stared at the cracked ground on the last day, even as the dust clung to their clothes and the taste of honey turned sour in their mouths, some corner of them hoped. Hoped that the silence would not last forever, that the mask would be worn again, that next time it might be just a little longer before the music stopped. The frost clung to the edge of the furrows like a forgotten thread, and your fingers ached before you even touched the plow. The field looked the same as always, cold, stubborn, gray. But something inside you still hummed, soft and strange, like an aftertaste you couldn't place. The boots on your feet were heavy again, caked with mud instead of powdered chalk. No ribbons, no masks, no color on your face, just dirt. And yet, as the ox trudged forward and the blade bit into the soil, you found your hands remembering the rhythm of drums, the sway of a dance, the way the bonfire crackled beneath a sky full of reckless stars. You had danced, hadn't you? Or at least clapped along. Maybe you even sang. You couldn't quite recall the words, but the tune lingered, clumsy and crooked, but alive. In this gray silence, it became your secret. No one spoke much on the first day back. There were nods, grunts, the slap of palm against harness, the groan of tools pushed too hard. But underneath the quiet was something softer, almost tender. Old Marson whistled without meaning to. A boy tried a jig with his shadow when he thought no one watched. A woman plucking feathers from a dead hen tapped her foot until she caught herself, startled. The fields were full of ghosts, not of the dead, but of the celebration itself, trailing behind people like fabric stuck to a boot. The festival had ended, yes. The booths were gone. The fools had vanished. The holy songs had returned to being flat and dutiful. But inside, something remained. Maybe it was the memory of heat on your cheeks, or the way the bread had tasted different, or how for once you weren't just a name in a ledger, but a person, visible, laughing, real. You didn't talk about it. That would have broken the spell. It wasn't a thing you held up to the light. It was something you let rest in your chest, like a coal under ash. But still, it shaped you. Work felt less cruel, at least for a while. Hunger didn't bite as hard. The mud wasn't quite as mean. You caught yourself smiling when you remembered how a grown man had danced with a goose on his head, or how the priest had blessed a loaf with a hiccup and no one had cared. There had been sweetness, absurdity, warmth. And that warmth didn't leave just because the tents came down. It followed you into the stable, into the well, into the prayer you mumbled with chapped lips. It made the monotony feel like something earned, not imposed. Like the price of magic, paid in sweat and aching shoulders. And maybe that was the real purpose of it all. Not escape, not indulgence, but storage. A way to store light inside your ribs for the months ahead. To hold laughter like grain. To carry rhythm into silence. You would not see the parade again for many moons. There would be deaths, debts, a late frost. The Lord would raise the tithe, and your boots would split at the toe. But when you stood in the cold, staring at the pale horizon, you might still hear a tambourine. You might still remember the taste of spiced cider, or how your child had laughed with a mask twice the size of his head. The festival didn't fix anything, but it gave you something no tax could touch. And so you pressed your weight into the plow, breathed through the sting in your spine and smiled, because the music was still there, quietly, patiently, waiting. That was the Middle Ages, not just toil and terror, but brief flickers of joy carved into the dark. Festivals were messy, absurd, sometimes blasphemous, often foolish. But they were human. In a world of hunger, disease, and silence, people made room for laughter. They danced when they could, sang when allowed, and turned even their grief into ritual. Maybe that's what kept them going. Not the prayers, not the laws, but the moments when the world tilted just a little and reminded them they were still alive. Maybe that's worth remembering. Maybe that's why we still gather, still feast, still find ways to be ridiculous together. Because somewhere deep down, we know what they knew: joy, however brief, is not a luxury, it's survival.